Hi, everyone. Welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. Thanks for the patience about the delay. We just had some technical glitches before we can start here, so we're just delayed by a little bit. So it's great to have a different topic on here today about the Royal Canadian Air Force, topic that I'm learning more and more about every day. I'm really excited about this one because it's an area I don't know too well. I'll say that up front, but we have a guest who knows a lot and has written on this. And I was going through some of it yesterday and the pictures and everything, and I'm very much impressed with what we're about to talk about today. So we got some different stuff. So today's guest is Donald Nijboer. He's looked at this and other parts of aircraft and aviation in the Second World War. So it's going to be great to have him on and have someone of his expertise to talk about this stuff. So just again, before we start, as usual, if there's any questions, anything like that, or any clarification you need, please do fire questions away, and I'm sure we'll have lots of insight about this because we got some knowledgeable people who will be watching. So it's going to be a good one. So hey, Donald, thanks for joining us.
Hey, how are you?
Good, I am good. So again, thanks for coming on. I was going over your book last night, a little bit of it, just because I've been so busy lately. I could only get through a little chunk of it, but it was great. This is stuff I don't know too well. Particularly the role of this 126 wing. So I'm really excited to get into that. So how I like to start usually, and this is pretty much how I ask everybody, is but this topic specifically, this one wing. Yeah. How did you come to write on this story?
Well, I had written a couple. My first book was with well, one of my first books was with Osprey, and I did a dual series, and it was P-38 Lightning versus the Ki-61 Japanese fighter in the South Pacific. And I think during that period, I came across a book written by Monty Berger called Invasions Without Tears. And right. His book, he was the intelligence officer with 126 Wing during prior to D-Day, and then D-Day through right until VE Day. And I read his book, and it was quite informative. And I didn't realize that 126 Wing was as effective as it was during the Second World War. And so then I pitched the 126 Wing to Osprey as part of their aviation elite units series. And they have a number of squadrons and groups and bomb groups and stuff of that nature. And I pitched them on that, and about a year and a half later, they said, yeah, let's go forward with that. And so then I moved forward with the book on 126 Wing and started the research process. And so it all started with Monty's book. It was my knowledge of the RCAF at that time in the Second World War was, I would say, like a lot of folks, not too in depth. There's not a lot of literature out there. There's some. There's some books, Reap the Whirlwind and Above and Beyond and things like that. So once I started digging deeper into the unit's history and the use of the Spitfire as a fighter bomber and the role it played as a mobile fighter wing, it became quite fascinating and quite interesting as how the 2nd Tactical Air Force and the U.S. 9th Tactical Air Force played a decisive role during the prior to D-Day and after D-Day and right through the victory till the end of the war in May 1945.
Yeah, and I mean, again, like I said just off the top, this isn't my level of expertise. I'm not an expert in this area whatsoever, but I know a little bit, and I've been to the sites, particularly in Normandy, where a lot of the 2nd Tactical Air Force was key. I mean, we'll get to that in a second, or later on in the presentation with some good photos and things like that came from your book. And seeing the sites where the airfields were, which is something that is so interesting to me, and we can get into that. About how it's set up and particularly, and you mentioned it already, this mobile wing. So I was wondering if you could just speak about that a little bit off the top, because that's kind of you talk about it in the book, but I just wondering if you could, how do I say this, explain it a little bit better for someone who may not quite understand what that means, right? Because I guess maybe where I'm coming from that is popularly, right, we have this almost maybe Battle of Britain bomber command image in our head of these airfields in England and everything like that.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could just talk about what that actually means on the ground.
So the mobile the fighting wing was part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and of course at the beginning of the war, the RAF didn't have a tactical air force. The RAF was basically three separate units: RAF Fighter Command, Bomber Command, and Coastal Command, and those were sort of the three main groups. And of course, early in the war, the Germans demonstrated the sort of combined arms technique of battle, which incorporated tanks, infantry, and a direct air support over the battlefield, which surprised the Allies, and in a lot of circumstances tended to be quite effective. And of course, the Germans also had a specialized aircraft, which was the Ju-87, which was a dive bomber. Mm-hmm. And during the Second World War, until way late in the war, the dive bomber was the most effective way of getting a bomb on target accurately. And level bombing, somewhat accurate, but the higher you flew, the less accurate you became. And that's why they needed 600 B-17s to hit a factory, because the accuracy wasn't that great. So, after the Battle of France and the loss of the Low Countries, the Brits were, quite taken aback by their failure in France to support the army, because the two branches were operating in different circumstances. The army wasn't connected to the RAF, and the RAF wasn't connected to the army. And the RAF didn't really want to allocate any resources to help the army, because they wanted to fight their air battle as they saw the air battle should be fought. It wasn't until the armies in the Western Desert during 41, 42 that the Brits realized that they're going to have to find a way of maximizing their air power in support of the army in the Western Desert against Rommel and the Italians. So that's where the Desert Air Force came into being, which was an air force to support the army. And so there was a cooperation between the Army and the Air Force, so they could allocate targets, they could be more specific, they could incorporate better communications between squadrons and groups, so that the Army had the air support that it needed to help fight the battle in the Western Desert. And so that's where the British Tactical Air Force came into being. So basically the Desert Air Force was the first tactical air force in the RAF. And that's where they began strapping bombs to fighters, P-40, Hurricane, things of that nature. And so they started utilizing fighters as fighter bombers. They were never intended to do that, but there's lots of examples during the Second World War where weapons were used not as they were originally designed, but they proved to be okay. And in a lot of circumstances, it was, this is what we've got, and this is how we're going to use it, because there's nothing else. So, in order to sort of maximize air power in the desert, they started strapping bombs to fighters. And then they had to start developing techniques to get the bombs on target, find the targets, assess the targets, prioritize the targets, find the munitions that would work best against certain targets. In the desert, the Brits developed the Hurricane tank buster with two 40mm cannon. And while it was effective, they also realized that flying that low, the casualty rate for the Hurricanes was quite high, because in that low-level regime, light flak and small arms fire is extremely accurate and deadly. That's what it proved throughout the Second World War, that light and medium flak below 10,000 feet was a very dangerous place to be, especially if you're flying around a well-defended target. So the fighter bombers encountered that, and so they had to develop techniques in order to get bombs on target without losing a lot of airplanes. And that's where they adopted the dive bombing technique.
And sorry to just stop you there. Again, I love these photos that you sent me. There's some really good ones in here. I kind of organized them a different way, but because you mentioned that, so we'll come back to these actually, because you just mentioned the we'll come back. But the idea of the dive bombing and the strafing attack, you gave me these great diagrams, and I think maybe this is a good point to talk about just generally what that means and what that looks like, and then we can probably come back to some of those earlier photos and talk about the wing itself, because I think this is a good time to set this up, because I don't think again, I'm not an air power historian. That's not my expertise. I'm more of the Army kind of thing. But this is great. I mean, to understand the different parts of this. I mean, I was wondering if maybe you could talk about this, like how this develops maybe on the Allied side, and because I just explaining these, I was staring at this graph for probably longer than I should have been last night. But it's really, really interesting to see the thought and the planning that went into this.
Yeah, well, they obviously, a lot of pilots in their pilot training, early in the war received very, very little gunnery training,
right.
Let alone gunnery training to, attack vehicles on the ground. Now, some of them did practice shooting at ground targets to get some practice, but they were generally being trained for air-to-air combat and not in the ground strafing role. So a lot of these guys learned on the job, basically, how best to attack a convoy from height. The height to approach, when to turn into the convoy. Basically, they realized that if you saw a convoy, you would fly parallel to the convoy, and then you would turn into the convoy and attack it lengthwise, as opposed to, as you see in some gun camera footage, there's a line of trucks and they're attacking it from the side.
Right.
They sort of developed that technique as they went along. Also, too, with the 126 Wing, prior to D-Day and during their stay in Europe, as they fought towards Germany, individual squadrons would be sent back to England for operational gun training camp or armament camps. So they would go back to England for a week or so and get a refresher course on strafing and bombing and things of that nature to sort of hone their skills. So basically, it was, as I mentioned before, the Desert Air Force was formed, and they started allocating the fighters to attack ground targets. The pilots and the squadrons themselves, and a lot of times, develop their own tactics on the best way to attack a convoy or such, especially if it was well defended by flak guns and things of that nature. And usually, the rule of thumb was you made one pass, and you didn't return, because by that time the guys were alerted, and you didn't know how many flak guns or machine guns there were with the convoy. So the chances of, getting hit the second time in a pass was far greater than the first time.
Right. And because that's an interesting point you make, because I've read accounts and things like that about second passes. So I was wondering about that, because again, like I said, this is great and showing, ideally what to do, but in reality, sometimes that's not how these things go. So that's another thing I was wondering about is like how they would go about doing that. So that makes sense, saying that's kind of like a rule, don't do a second pass. But is that something that was common if they felt it was, safe enough to do so? Like, because again, maybe we'll come to this later, but you included pictures of fillets, right? Fillets caps. Yeah. So it's in a situation like that, is that something different, or?
Well, it's hard to say. Well, it's not hard to say, but for the sensitive targets, Germans, if the Germans had a sensitive target, they were well protected. So, and so let's say it was a mechanized unit of tanks. Usually the Panzer divisions and the Panzer Grenadier divisions had a good complement of flak guns and mobile flak guns and things of that nature. So they were well protected, and so, or if it was a ammunition dump or marshalling yard or something like that was important to the Germans, they would defend it vigorously. So again, the rule of thumb was make one pass and don't return. Same with airfields, because they were well defended as well. And basically, a lot of squadrons learned the hard way, which was they decided to make a second pass, and that's the one where it would get the squadron leader, or they would lose 2 planes or something like that if they were a little bit over eager. And also too, usually, if it was the last guy in the squadron of say 12 planes, if he was the last one to strafe the convoy and they were alerted, then he would receive the most flak or defensive fire, and then he would probably, not dive as steeply or as low to attack the target. So then his accuracy and epic power would be negated because the flak was coming up, and basically that was the rule of thumb too. Is once the Germans started shooting at you, your accuracy decreased. It's just human nature. A lot of pilots will tell you that it wasn't conducive to more accurate shooting, let's say.
Right.
So once the flak started coming up, that was that took you off your aiming and your diving and things of that nature. So because at the end of the day, flak was the first objective of an anti-aircraft gun is to throw off your aim.
Right.
And if you do that, then you've done your job. So the bomb doesn't hit the target and destroy it. Second is, try and shoot the plane down, damage it as much as you can. But if you can throw off the aim, then you've done your job. And that's why sometimes anti-aircraft defenses in the Second World War, both Allied and German and Japanese, get second shift as far as saying it's a waste of ammunition. They weren't effective. Fighters were more effective at shooting down other airplanes. But in fact, flak guns shot down more planes than fighter aircraft shot down planes, especially on the outside. So first job, increase accuracy. The second job, damage and shoot down your enemy. And again, below 10,000 feet over the European battlefield, both Allied and German flak defenses were quite robust.
Right. I mean, the footage that you can see, the accounts and everything makes it quite clear that there's a lot of anti-aircraft fire.
Well, there was a saying, a gunner's saying in Normandy, if it flies, it dies.
Yeah, it's true.
And unfortunately, a lot of Allied fighters were shot down.
Yeah.
Because the gunners were just like, oh, there's an airplane, shoot. Because by the time they had to assess, and of course, aircraft recognition in the Second World War was not very good.
No.
By the time the gunners had assessed, is this an enemy? And especially if the fighter nose was pointed at you.
Right.
If the fighter was coming at you, then they would go, oh, let's start shooting first and ask questions later.
Right. Yeah, and that's quite common. And a lot of people on the ground were no big fans of the airplanes, especially even their own side. But maybe we can get back to that. So I just wanted to do that because I think that was a great time to talk about that. So I was wondering if we can, now we'll go back here and talk about the wing itself, because I just think these are some amazing photos that we'll get to. But these are great. So I was just wondering if we could start talking about the 126 wing and kind of how that develops, if that's okay, if we can talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, I don't have exact dates off the top of my head, but
that's okay. Just a general understanding of how we get here.
July of 43, the tactical airfield, 126 tactical airfield was formed, and that was I think 401, 411, and 412 squadron. There were 3 squadrons in the ring originally. And they were flying out of England, of course. And so the first sort of jobs were, the Allies were preparing the Allied Expeditionary Air Force in preparation for D-Day. And so 126 Airfield was part of that. And it would later become 126 Wing, which would be the mobile wing. So it was initially formed with three squadrons of Spitfires, Mark 9s, about 18 aircraft per squadron. And they spent a lot of 43 doing fighter sweeps, escorting B-26, B-25 bombers, hitting targets in France and the Low Countries. As far as fighter activity in that period went, it was quite sparse because the Germans just weren't coming up to challenge these formations. The Germans didn't have a large fighter force in France and in the Low Countries at that point. And so the chances for the pilots at 126 Wing to meet enemy fighters was sporadic. And I think prior to D-Day, I guess from July 43 until D-Day, they had shot down maybe 20, enemy aircraft, 20, 28, something in that nature. But what it did do for the squadrons flying those missions was obviously it gave them lots of airtime.
Right.
It gave them time to develop tactics. It gave time for flight leaders, squadron leaders, time to hone their skills, know their aircraft, radio procedures, formations, what worked, what didn't. Obviously flying over enemy territory was a big deal. Facing flak. So, getting the nature of the battlefield, so to speak. So by the time D-Day came, the pilots had high time hours. They'd been to armament camps. The leadership and tactics were well honed. The bad pilots were weeded out. So a lot of these guys were on their second tours. So there was a lot of, experience. Again, Canadian forces in Europe were basically all volunteers, so they all wanted to be there. They weren't draftees, and so they had good leadership. They had good pilots. So it was by the time D-Day came, and as I said before, the 126 Airfield morphed into the mobile fighting wing, which meant the three squadrons would move with the Army as it moved and advanced the front. So the Army went, the mobile fighter wing went, and it was there to support the ground forces. So its first job was to maintain air superiority over the battlefield, given a certain section of the front. And its second job was to provide the Army with direct support in its progress towards Germany. And so their job was to move when the Army moved and keep the airfield as close to the front as possible. And that was one of the first objectives of D-Day, was to get as far inland as possible in the first 3 or 4 days so that the Allies could start building airfields.
Right.
A lot's been talked about, well, Monty didn't get Caen on the first day, as he said, and that might have been part of the plan, or he might have said it, I don't know. But the real objective, or one of the prime objectives on D-Day, was to get inland and get to the places where they could start building airfields. And I think it was D-Day +3 that they had the first emergency strips. Which meant if you had a damaged airplane, you could land and you didn't have to fly across the channel and possibly ditch. The second stage was airfields that could provide fuel and armament, so that you could land at these airfields, gas up, get more bullets, go back and fight, and then at the end of the day, you would fly back to England, and overnight, and then do that again. And then the third stage was airfields that were self-supporting, so the fighters didn't have to go back to England. They had enough stores, men, food, accommodation, that the mobile wing was independent of, or was self-sufficient enough to make it.
Yeah, and that's great. I had a question for you. You might not know, I don't know, but again, this could just be from my understanding, is because this is an RCAF wing. And again, I could be going on about this. So anyway, sorry, with Mackenzie King's policies and everything, how does a fighter wing, which I would say, studying King for years now, he would say that's much more dangerous. How does something like that develop in the RCAF when they're trying to minimize casualties? Is this something that just developed naturally? Was it done on purpose?
Well,
how does the actual wing come about?
Yeah, I think from what I've been reading in the last few years, there's a lot of the early literature about the Battle of Normandy and things of that nature, and the battle in Europe. They said, well, the Allied forces won because they had superior artillery and superior air forces, and they basically just ground down the German forces, and it wasn't the infantry and it wasn't the armor that played a major role. And so the Allies had that advantage. And part of the Allied strategy at the beginning of the war, especially when America joined the war, is they consciously decided to allocate more resources. Steel, as the new sort of term has come up in the latest histories, to negate ground force casualties, because Britain knew, and this is a throwback to the First World War, because the casualties were so heavy that that's the one thing they were really worried about, was that they didn't want to have those high casualty rates because they didn't have the manpower for it. They just couldn't bring enough troops to bear to match the Germans. So they opted for strategic bombing, and then later they morphed their air forces into tactical air forces to help support the ground forces. So in order to negate heavy infantry and ground force casualties, they upped the number of aircraft they produced, adopted a strategic bombing campaign, and also added more artillery to their Army Corps, infantry, tank, much more than the Germans had, and that was part of their strategy. So it was, again, we talked about the combined arms strategy. So the Allies were using strategic, tactical, and the ground forces basically almost in concert, because we also know that the Army requested heavy bombers to bomb targets on the battlefield, which some might say that's like overkill, but it doesn't matter. If you want to win the battle, you just drop ordnance as you want in your enemy and try to save as many lives of your guys as you possibly can.
Right. Yeah, so that's fascinating in terms of these things, because again, it's just something that's a Canadian focus, particularly in historiography and discussions, is about all of these things of the limited liability and everything like that. So I think it's something that it needs to be discussed in any kind of in the more the strategic level, the higher level, but it's still an interesting.
Yeah, interesting enough, though, even though the Allies had this preponderance of aircraft and artillery and things of that nature, the Canadian Army in Europe, along with the British and the Americans, they all experienced, shortages of infantry. It was, units went into battle at half strength. At some point, they began stripping anti-aircraft units for infantry, and basically they were combing through, all the units they thought they could comb through to get more bodies into the infantry units, even though they had, again, this superiority over the battlefield with aircraft and tanks and artillery. The poor infantry were still suffering heavy casualties because
big time.
In order to take an objective, you have to have boots on the ground.
Yep. Yeah, so that's an excellent point, and we'll come back to that, because I want to talk about one thing in particular with this wing. But and maybe this is a good time to launch into this too, is with looking at these pictures. And there's been some just talk on Twitter and social media about this. And this is how we brought it up when me and you were talking in emails and things like that. Is the Spitfire, right? A completely iconic aircraft, loved by lots and lots of people. And when I was younger, it was one of my favorites. I think I'm moving away from that for numerous reasons. But anyway, so because these are Spitfire squadrons, right? This, as we talked about, they're doing, runs over France before D-Day, and the support missions and everything. And you were talking to me about this in the email about its role as the fighter bomber and not so good. Again, we're not here just to disparage an aircraft, but I was wondering if we could talk about the Spitfire, the plane itself, and its role, and maybe some of its, the good things, and maybe some of the things that was lacking.
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons the Spitfire became a fighter bomber was because they just had a lot of them. And
I was going to ask that. Sorry, yeah, I meant to ask that as part of this. Is that why? It's just there's a lot hanging out, so we've got to put them to use.
They were building so many of the things that by the time, I think it was by the end of 42, I think, the RAF Fighter Command had 100 squadrons of Spitfires, something like that. Wow. And it wasn't until mid 42 that they started releasing Spitfires to other theaters, particularly the Mediterranean. It wasn't until like May or April or something like that in 42 that they actually started sending Spitfires to Malta because they wanted to hang on to these Spitfires in England.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for that reason, it was, it was the fighter that was there. It was available, and they were producing it, and factories were humming along. And ironically enough, it was the Typhoon that was supposed to replace the Spitfire after the Battle of Britain, because the Air Ministry thought that the Spitfire had run its design course, and that they couldn't stretch any more out of the design, and that the Sabre engine Typhoon would be the one that would come and replace it. But as we know, the Typhoon did not live up to its reputation as a replacement for the Spitfire. So they discontinually modified the Spitfire in its role. So it was there, it was available. As a fighter bomber, as a dive bomber, it wasn't very good in that role, because it was never designed to do that. Right. Either was a Thunderbolt or the Mustang. So that's not to disparage just the Spitfire.
Right.
Interesting thing is that the Brits and the Americans, they adopted the dive bombing technique, but they didn't incorporate a specifically designed dive bomber to form squadrons. Now, the Americans did that in the Mediterranean with the A-36, which was a Mustang version dive bomber, and it had dive brakes, and it could carry about 2,000 pounds of bombs, and it was accurate, and it was effective. They built about 500, but then it stopped, and they didn't make any more, and they didn't incorporate it into the tactical air forces that they were going to use in Normandy. So the Spitfire, great air superiority fighter, did a really good job in air reconnaissance, great interceptor, held its own throughout the war against the Germans. But as a dive bomber, just because of its nature and its design, it wasn't very good. And there are a number of reasons for that. First off, again, it wasn't designed to do that. The pilots' recollections I recall reading about is the fact that, they would approach the target from about 10,000 feet. They would go into a dive. Problem with the Spitfire was and Mustang, and I would say Thunderbolt as well, that in the dive, the speed increased. Right. You had no way to adjust your speed. Now, the purpose-built dive bomber like the Dauntless or the Helldiver or the Stuka, they had dive brakes. They would pop out, and you would have a constant speed in your dive, so that you could line up your target. So the Spitfire pilots were gaining speed in their dive, and so they would have to pull out of their dive sooner because of the G-forces in the pullout would be greater at a lower level. So that was the first handicap, is they were speeding up in the dive. Second handicap was their sight. They didn't have a dive bombing sight. They just used their gun sight to align it on the target. So that was another hindrance. And the other part was because there was no bomb clutch to swing the bomb out from the arc of the propeller.
Right.
They would align their target, and they would have to slightly pull up and then release their bomb. So their gun sight would move off the target, and then they would release their thing. The other part was because small arms fire was really good up to about 3,000 feet, rifle caliber bullets, and heavy and medium flak. They were releasing their bombs from around 3,000 feet. So the accuracy, again, gets thrown off. Yeah. So you have excess speed in a dive, not a real proper gun sight. You have to drop your bomb by slightly pulling up and then releasing. So you're off target. You're not seeing your target anymore. Yeah. And then you have to worry about the light flak at that level. So you're bombing from a higher level than a normal dive bomber would. So you put all these factors in, and it's not surprising that, it wasn't a great dive bomber.
I mean, I was going to say, I think, again, I just was doing some reading and my understanding of this, because I didn't really know that this was a big debate until somebody, I announced this show and then got talking to some other people about it. And I'm like, well, that just makes sense. I mean, it makes perfect sense. It seems to be that it's not designed to do this. So why should we be surprised that it's not doing the best job? I guess maybe that becomes from, like you were mentioning earlier, other aircraft somehow eventually, and through some work and experience and some slight changes and things like that, became good at doing things they were not designed to do. So maybe, I don't know, again, I'm just kind of speculating here. That's kind of what happened here. People just would assume that these things would happen. I don't know, but it's just, that's what it seems like I'm getting from the Spitfire specifically.
Yeah. And the other part too is its armament as well was of all the fighters that were used as fighter bombers in the European theater, its armament was probably the weakest. And there was, they were still using 303-inch caliber machine guns prior to D-Day and after. But prior to D-Day, the Air Ministry was also beginning to push to get more 50 caliber guns into the Spitfire. And I come across minute meetings and things like that. They were, prior to D-Day, they were pushing to get more 50 caliber machine guns into the Spitfires as opposed to the 303-inch. And this was beginning to happen. I think it was it's the E wing that has the 50 caliber and the 20 millimeter cannon. And they also realized too that strafing was probably one of the most effective jobs that the fighter bombers did, including Mustang and P-38 and T-47 against soft-skinned vehicles, as far as accuracy was concerned and destructive power. So the Spitfire had two 20 millimeter cannon, and let's go for the E-wing and 250 caliber machine guns. So of the fighter bombers that were used in Europe, it was probably the lightest armed. Maybe the P-38 had the lightest armament, but so in that sense too, its strafing power was not as great. But that's just the nature of the aircraft. Now, for air-to-air, it was fine. I mean, the 126 wing was the most successful fighter wing on the continent from D-Day to VE Day. They shot down 333 enemy aircraft, and so obviously for air-to-air combat, that was more than adequate. But for ground attack, not so much. And it's also interesting too that they formed the Tactical Air Force, the 2nd Tactical Air Force. It's mostly made up of Spitfires, and then second place was the Typhoons. And then I guess, I can't remember how many Mustangs the RAF had, but they were in there as well. Throw them in the mix. But if you look at the sort of German version of the Focke-Wulf 190, the ground attack version, they put armor plate on the bottom, around the cockpit, around the parts of the engines. But they never did that with the Spitfire or the Mustang or the P-38. And when you consider it was an inline engine, a rifle bullet through the radiator or the oil tank or the glycol tank, that's all it took. And your engine would overheat in a matter of minutes because it would be toast. So they were quite vulnerable to flak and rifle caliber bullets. But that was never really addressed either. They went, okay, we've got Spitfire, we need it for ground attack, put some bombs on it, and train the boys a bit. They didn't receive a lot of training in the dive bombing area as well. A lot of times it was, okay, this is what you're gonna need to do. Here you go, boys. And they found through operational research that dive bombing with fighter bombers, with fighters like the Spitfire, wasn't very accurate at all. We're reading one part, there was one day of operations in Germany or over Germany, they dropped 100 500-pound bombs on a rail interdiction mission that day, and they had 16 hits, direct hit. So it took a lot of bombs, a lot of sorties to actually destroy a target. And I remember my parents were originally Dutch, and they were young during the war. And I remember my father telling me, he said, yeah, we had a bridge near our village. And he said, the Allies, they came over and they bombed it a bunch of times. And he said, they never hit it. And I was like, as a young guy beginning to read about the Second World War and the Air Forces and Typhoons. And I was like, what do you mean they didn't hit it? They had these fighter bombers that could do all these things. And he said, no, they missed it all the time. So I remember the, so
Yeah.
accuracy was an issue, which meant more sorties had to be flown against certain targets in order to destroy them. So it wasn't the most efficient way. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, two things I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned this in the book, and I think it was an interesting part of the book. Which, before I forget, I've included links below to purchase it. It's a really interesting look at this, and I think you did a good job, Donald. And I'm going to praise people when they deserve it. Is talking about the bigger stuff, the little stuff. I love both, because I was just so engrossed in it and got lost in a lot of stuff. But the one that I found was really interesting, and you can see it in this picture, is the actual. And we've had some questions about armaments, which we'll get to in a second. But the bombs themselves, that was an interesting part of your book, talking about the testing and everything. And I was wondering if you could talk about that real quick.
Well, of course, the Spitfire, not originally designed to carry bombs, and also too, it could only carry 1,000 pounds of bombs,
Right.
Where the Typhoon could go max 2,000, Thunderbolt 2,000, Mustang 2,000. So in this picture, we see the Spitfire, has two 250-pound bombs and a single 500-pound bomb. I would question the destructive power of the 250-pound bomb, but this is what they had, so they wanted to maximize the destructive power. Also, too, the bomb shackles for these bombs were designed for level bombers.
Okay.
They weren't designed in any way for diving at an angle.
Right.
So sometimes that was a bit of an issue. So you have to look at the destructive power of the bombs. Also, too, when you hear it's a 250-pound bomb or a 500-pound bomb, basically half the weight is the steel casing of the bomb.
Yep.
So the explosive power of the bomb is around 500-pound bombs, around 200 pounds or 250 pounds of actual explosive.
Yep.
And also, too, again, with the Spitfire, carrying a 500-pound bomb, a single 500-pound bomb, its range was greatly restricted. So this played into its range and its fuel capacity as well. So the Spitfire, the 126 wing, had to be close to the battlefront in order to be effective, because the farther away it was, the transit time to the front or targets in Germany was far greater. So because of its limited range, carrying a 500-pound bomb the range was even shorter. So it would, again, limit its target selection and its effectiveness again.
Yeah, I mean, that was because again, you provide that in the book, the actual numbers and everything, which I'm not going to ask you to do now, because it's a lot of technical and a lot of numbers. But just to me, that was so striking, and even the things that they were noting in the report that you reproduced about, the pull of the aircraft and all of that stuff. To me, that's fascinating kind of technical detail, and I think that's. I'm not really trying to knock anybody, but like things like people get, whether it's airplanes, tanks, whatever, people get lost in the technical details. But things like that, to me, are far more interesting and far more important. Being like, how does the actual performance and what did the people using them think? Yeah. And that's what comes to me with the bombings on a Spitfire, right? It's just when these things in your head, you're like, these things don't go together, and yet they did, just not very well.
Well, it says a lot to the pilots and the job that they had to do. They carried them out every day. Of course, again, in this picture too, one point I could bring up is that when the Spitfire was fully loaded with this configuration, 60% of the accidents that occurred with the plane were burst tires because of the weight of the carry.
The weight,
and it just goes back to the fact that it was not designed to do this. And of course, they were flying on rough strips, not paved runways. No. And so there was that issue, and also too, when I talked about the strafing and the ground attack, a number of Spitfires are also lost due to ricochets from their own guns. They come back, hit the radiator, hit the engine, things of that nature, because it was a dangerous job, and most of the losses suffered by the 126 wing were due to German anti-aircraft fire.
Yeah.
And also, too, I'll bring up another point, too, because it was, it's a tactical fighter wing, or part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and the 2nd Tactical Air Force was assigned to 21st Army Group and the Canadian Army in Europe, and their job was to provide support for the Army. Some of this was direct support, where they would be assigned a target that the ground forces were assigned to take.
Yep.
And then the other sorties were flown as sort of interdiction. So basically, 2/3 of the sorties that were flown by 126 Wing were not over the battlefield directly in support of the Army. They were behind the lines, attacking transportation, barges, convoys, ammo dumps, that sort of thing. Because direct support of the Army was a far more difficult task than I think a lot of people had been led to believe, that, oh, they just call up fighter bombers and they bomb that German bunker and infantry would pour through and things of that nature. It was never sort of as straightforward as that.
No, never
and
was.
So the guys who were running the show realized this, and that's why 2/3 of the sorties they were flown were armed reconnaissance, dive bombing behind the enemy lines and attacking transportation, which meant that the flow of supplies for the Germans was slowed or stopped completely.
Yeah.
Well, that meant less gasoline, less food, less ammunition, and probably one of the most graphic examples of that would have been the Battle of the Bulge. Once the skies began to clear, then the Germans felt the full weight of the Allied air forces, and they just couldn't get supplies to their units that were in the field.
I think that's a good point to make. And you see this often, maybe in like popular culture, but also in some discussions and things like that about, why aren't they directly supporting this, or it accounts from soldiers on the ground? It's like, well, they are. They're just, you can't see them. They're behind. They're helping you in another way. Instead of accidentally dropping that 500-pound bomb on you, they're behind the enemy lines, which I think is important to keep in mind, for particularly when you hear tactical air force, right? People make an assumption about what that means, and it misses some of the point, I think. Yeah, so I just wanted to, this is a question I think I know the answer, but I just want to double check, because Scott, a good supporter of the channel, I don't think they were, but were the Spitfires ever equipped with rockets?
Not that I know of. I'm sure they did experiments at in England, equipping the Spitfire with rockets.
Right.
But my guess is it probably wasn't well suited.
Right.
And given over to that's one of the reasons that Typhoons was given rockets, because they knew that bombing accuracy wasn't that great, and they thought that the rockets would give them a better chance, a greater accuracy.
Right.
To a certain degree, that it did. We all, people have this. Well, not everybody, but it's always been this conception that Typhoons would come in and destroy German tanks and with the rockets. I grew up with that idea too when I first started reading about the Second World War, and they destroyed tanks and Panthers, Tigers, and then they did the operational research, and then they realized that it took 100 rockets to get a hit on a tank, and something absurd like that. And so, in order to do that, you have to fly a number of sorties and get down there, But tanks, there was a few tanks that obviously were destroyed by rocket fire, but not in the sense that, they got a radio call and they sent up a squadron of Typhoons, and they saw 10 Panthers and they destroyed them all. It did a good job as far as negating mobility on the battlefield, morale for German troops, the constant attack. They could move at night, but they couldn't move during the day. All that stuff contributed to the deterioration of the combat effectiveness of the German army. Yeah,
and there's some photos we'll get to in a second. And another one I don't want to forget, because I think it's a good question from Sheldrake, is, and you might not know, but the casualty, because you just mentioned the Typhoon, did you come across any numbers, anything about the casualties, the two different aircraft at all, or was there a difference? Was it similar?
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head, but just in general, the casualty rates with the Spitfires and Typhoons, and I'm not going to go out on a limb, but I would probably guess that they're probably pretty even, just because of the environment they were flying in. I might guess that the Typhoons maybe suffered a bit more because they had to deliver their rockets at a lower level, and they were probably staying at that height longer than, say, a Spitfire doing a dive bombing a run. Right. I'm just a little bit of conjecture, but from what I've read about the Normandy campaign and the campaign into into Europe and the Low Countries. Both Typhoon and Spitfire squadrons suffered heavy casualties, mostly due to flak.
Yep.
I mean, the 126 Wing lost 98 Spitfires D-Day to VE Day, and mostly to flak.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a bit.
Yeah, that's a high number.
Yeah, it's a high number there. Now, fortunately, a lot of pilots were able to bail out and make it back to the squadron stuff, but some were obviously prisoners of war. I think I've got the figure here. I think they lost 98 pilots. Yeah, 98 pilots were either killed POW during that period. So, and I would say the Typhoon squadrons probably suffered the same casualty rate, maybe a little bit higher, because there was no real difference as far as how Spitfire was a rugged airplane, Typhoon was a rugged airplane. Both could take hits. Again, it depended on where you got hit. I would say
right.
The Merlin and the Sabre engine were probably just as vulnerable to flak hits.
Right.
Sabre engine was probably a bit more temperamental than the Merlin.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But I would say, I can't sort of definitively say Typhoon suffered more casualties than the Spitfire.
Right. Yeah. It's more of a understanding from your work and research. I think that's a fair assumption, especially because looking at it just technically.
And also, you have to, I think, factor into where they were, where they were assigned over the battlefield too.
Right.
In more battles. So
yeah,
that's something I could probably do a little later on. I have to do a bit of research on that, but.
Yeah, but I think that's a good question, just even to think about it in general, right? Different types of aircraft, what they're facing. But like you said, it's where they are, what they're doing, and everything like that you have to keep in mind for these kinds of things. It's not always apples and oranges. It's not always apples and apples, right? Sometimes it's apples and oranges. But
how many flak guns? And how many flak guns the Germans decided to assign to a certain area?
Right.
So, as you got closer to the German border near the Rhine, because the Rhine was a major transportation node for the Germans, there was a lot of flak guns along the Rhine. So
a lot, yeah.
If you flew in that area, your chances of getting hit by flak were far greater than, say, if you were flying, in southern France with the French army, where the Rhine defenses probably weren't as robust. But so depending on your target area, how sensitive the Germans felt the area was that needed to be protected. And so a lot of factors go into it.
Oh yeah, big time. And I just wanted to draw attention to this picture for a couple of reasons. Like you said, the airstrip is not always a smooth pavement. This one's not, as you can see. And then talking again about, we began with the movement and how it's a mobile wing and everything. You can see in the background the construction that's gone into it and everything. These are some fascinating photos and really illustrate it in a good way of showing what they had to do, and it's great stuff. And there's just some more, another one with the bombs on it, which is great to see. But I do want to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
If you go back to that photograph, you can see how that's a great illustration of how compressed the tire is.
Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, yeah. Hold on. Give me a second here. Yeah, let's take a second look. Yeah, that is particularly bad. So much weight. Yeah, I can see why they blew. It's
also true on a note on the mobile wing. When the Allies landed in D-Day, they had airfield construction units that were some of the first to go ashore.
Yeah, right.
D-Day plus 2, 3. And those units numbered 20,000 men. And their job was to service and build airfields. That's 20,000 guys.
Mm-hmm.
That's all they do.
Yep.
That's quite a bit. That's, from a resource point of view, that's where the Allies had that abundance of resources and planning and training and with the mobile fighter wing, these guys could be at an airfield today. They could get an order at 3:00 this afternoon saying, you got to move.
Yep.
And you got to go over here. And so the sort of, I think it was called A party, they would be the lead guys. Right. They would jump in their trucks and their Jeeps and they would drive at night, find the place on the map they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
You know, could be a farmer's pasture, or, you know, in some cases it was an abandoned German airfield, which was a bit of a luxury. Didn't happen very often.
Yeah.
And then they would, you know, mark the spot, and then, you know, everybody would have to pack up their stuff, tents, fuel, bombs, ammunition, pile it into trucks, and then that convoy would have to find its way to that cow pasture or wherever it was, and then get there, set up shop, and be ready for flight operations the next day.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just astounding that you know, that they were able to do that. Now, of course, they practiced that before in England. They ran exercises. But I can't imagine driving through a rainstorm at night with no road signs in Europe to tell you where you are.
Yeah.
To get to a point on the map and say, okay, this is the place.
Yeah.
And also, too, sometimes they'd get there, they'd set up shop, they'd fly for 4 or 5 days, and then they get the orders again to move.
And then to move, right?
Move.
Yeah.
The flight was moving, right?
And it's crazy to think about.
And one of the drawbacks of the Spitfire was its range.
Right.
So sometimes 126 wing was inactive because it was too far behind the front, because the Army had moved too far. So their flight operations would stop until they moved to another airfield closer, because basically the Mark 9 had the same amount of gas, could carry the same amount of gas as the Mark 1 Spitfire. It was like 85 gallons.
Mm-hmm.
But they also increased the range by putting a slipper tank underneath, 45 or 90 gallon slipper tank. But that meant you couldn't carry a 500-pound bomb.
Right.
So your destructive power for ground attack was lessened because you had greater range, yes, but you didn't carry as much.
Yeah, it's definitely a trade-off. Yeah, for what you have to do. But I wanted to go back because you mentioned earlier, it's one of the most effective and units, because you mentioned that in the book that's part of the argument. And that is impressive all on its own. But to me, which is still so striking, like you were just talking about, is the mobile aspect of this. And like you said, you talk about this in quite good detail in the book, is moving at night. You're not quite sure where you are. You're not quite sure where you're going. And then that they can do this so fast. To me, that's probably one of the most impressive parts of this, is the ability to do that, to plan for that, to train for that, and being able to bring these weapons. It might not be the best weapon for the role, but still being able to bring this weapon system, the Spitfire, to bear on the enemy that quickly. Yeah. You talk about, they finally got outstripped, but that has more to do with the Allies doing well, which is a good thing, than anything, right? Because after the breakout of Normandy, which we'll get to. But it's just, to me, that's just one big thing I wanted to mention, is why it's impressive to me and everything. But I do want to go in here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
We talked about, yes, Spitfire wasn't a great dive bomber and air support, ground attack aircraft, and that's fine because it really wasn't designed to do that. But as an air superiority fighter over the battlefield, it was quite effective, and that was its first job. So the first job of the mobile fighter wing was air superiority over the battlefield. Don't let the Germans get near us, and that's your first job. Second job, start bombing these guys. And in that sense, that role, they were highly successful, and as also first for the Spitfires of 126 wing, they were the first Allied fighter to actually shoot down an ME-262 with gunfire.
Oh.
So it was 411 Squadron, sometime in October, with the exact date. Now, prior to that, two ME-262s had been brought down by 8th Air Force P-47 Thunderbolts.
Right, those are the ones I know about.
Yeah. Well, the two ME-262s that were brought down were not shot down. The combat involved the P-47s forcing the 262 to crash land.
Mm.
Now they forced it down. Now, having read the accounts of this, and ironically, the two times that the first two ME-262s that were brought down were forced crash landings, it was the same pilot who crash landed in the 262.
Okay.
So it makes me wonder if the pilot was really highly skilled and knew that to continue in an air-to-air combat with the Thunderbolts being outnumbered, his best chance of survival was to
Just get out.
crash land the aircraft because he was too low to bail out.
Right.
And he wouldn't have won the gunfight.
No.
So,
not with that point, no.
so those two were brought down not by gunfire. It was the Spitfires of 411 Squadron in October. There's, I think, 5 pilots involved that were the first Allied pilots to actually shoot down an ME-262 in air-to-air combat.
Yeah, and that's impressive. Another feather in the cap of the wing, I guess. Anyway, so yeah, that's great. I do want to move forward here and talk about the element of what we kind of sold the show with is the dive bombing and everything, because we had a good question. I think this is a good way to look at it, is the stumbling blocks and the issues with air support and calling in support. I was wondering if you could talk about because we're getting over the hour, I don't want to go too much longer, but this is important, I think, about how they would go about doing this. I mean, you mentioned this, it's not always what they're doing, but when they are doing this, how do they go about it? Is there it's in the name, right? Is there a tactical element where the boots on the ground could be like, we need support here? Was that something they were able to do?
Yeah, they were able to do that, and I think the Typhoon squadrons played a greater role in that. And they had they called it a cab rank system. It was more the exception than the rule to use.
Okay.
So basically, what they did is they were attempting to start a battle or get to an objective and get through an objective. They would assign 3 or 4 Typhoon squadrons to a particular part of the battlefield, and they would always have a number of Typhoons flying over, waiting to be called in to attack a specific target. So the cab rank name came from, I think, London cabs, as they were lined up in London to wait for rides. A cab rank system.
Of course,
somebody might be able to correct me on that. But so they were basically on call with a forward observer to be able to tell them, okay, we've got a target here, the left side of this town. There's some artillery pieces or mortar positions or things of that nature. The Typhoons would go in, rocket bomb those specific targets. Another 12 aircraft would take off and replace that cab rank flying over the specific area. And so they were able to do that and call in tactical air power. I don't recall any of the cab rank being used with the 126 wing.
Okay.
The Typhoons were more specialized in that sort of area.
Right.
But the problem with cab rank was it was, as far as resources and fuel and time and aircraft, it used a lot of airplanes, because you would need at least 3 or 4 squadrons in order to keep this constant flow of aircraft over the battlefield to be called in. Now, the other problem they had was, identifying the target, pilots identifying the target on the ground.
Yeah.
They would, the infantry units could mark it with smoke, things of that nature, or the ground observer could give a description to the pilots above. And that lent itself to all kinds of problems itself, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Misidentification of targets, because in the Second World War, it's not like the First World War where you had these lines of trenches and you could see where the front line was.
Yep.
And you had a pretty good idea of where the Germans were and where your good guys were.
Mm-hmm.
But European battlefield, if you took off and got up to 5,000 feet, there was no discernible battlefield or front line.
No, right.
And so that sort of lent itself into difficulties. And they ran into that problem during the Normandy battles when the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command were assigned to bomb the battlefield. Some of the crews didn't realize what color smoke was being used. The order didn't get up through the chain of command to the lead bomber crews, and so they mistook smoke for the target, and their bombs fell short and killed quite a few Allied soldiers. So there were a few problems with that. So cab rank was used. Troops could call in air support, but the Tactical Air Force they were a little bit reluctant to do that because, they wanted the infantry and the tank units to basically fight those battles with the artillery that they had.
Right.
Because they knew that the accuracy of the fighter bombers wasn't necessarily all all that great. So a lot of times targets would be bombed. It would raise the morale of the troops. But if the Germans kept their heads down and stayed in their bunkers and in their trenches, unless you got, highly accurate direct hits, after the bombing was done, they just pop up their heads and, start shooting. And that was the same with artillery too. It wasn't just the fighter bombers.
Yeah, exactly.
In order for the artillery to be highly effective, it was the timing of when the artillery barrage started and when it ended, and when the infantry closed in on the target.
Yeah.
And the good troops who had experience with a rolling barrage, they could follow the barrage right onto the target, and that wouldn't give time for the Germans to pop out of their trenches and start fighting. But if their timing was off, and the troops were behind the barrage, then the Germans would have time to pop out of their trenches and bunkers and attack the Allied troops.
Yeah, I mean that's a particularly, like you already mentioned, in Normandy with that was the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command hitting Canadian and Polish troops during Total Eyes and Tractable is probably the main example. But that's high level, bombing. Yeah. This is different. So but again, it's the same issues, right? Marking targets, issues of smoke. The RAF thinking one color smoke means one thing, First Canadian Army thinking it means another, which is a major problem. But anyway, all of that did lead to the Falaise Gap, again, fighting over the terminology of what it's called, doesn't matter. But anyway, so I did want to talk about that, and I think it's a good place to kind of wrap up, is I wanted to talk about and ask about the role of this wing in the Falaise Gap, right? Because that's the popular perception, right? There's this tiny little hole that they're all trying to get through, and they're getting pummeled constantly. Artillery, airstrikes, further advances, everything. So does this wing play an important part at Falaise?
Oh, yeah. I would say that, 126 wing and all the fighter bomber wings in the both tactical air forces, this was an example of where the firepower of the mobile fighter wing and the fighter bomber really asserted itself. Here was an army in full retreat, convoys, traffic congestion, targets of opportunity. I mean, these guys are flying 3 or 4 sorties a day and hitting new targets. And this again comes into where, their machine gun armament was probably the most effective at the destruction of the retreating Germans. A lot of soft-skinned vehicles, towed artillery, fuel Bowsers, trucks, armored cars. When they went through the battlefield later, they realized that most of the abandoned tanks or tanks that were left behind were just basically ran out of fuel. And that was part of what the tactical air forces did, was denied the Germans the ability to move supplies to keep their army moving. And that's why those tanks ran out of gas. It wasn't, a rocket from a Typhoon. It was the bombing they did before that stopped the Germans from getting the fuel to their tanks. And they did, it was, a classic display of what tactical air power could do with an army in full retreat.
Yeah, and I think, this picture, just brings up the point you mentioned just now and previously in the show about the soft-skinned vehicles and the towed artillery. This is a perfect photo to sum up what they did to them. I mean, this isn't the photos you usually see of the Falaise Gap. They're usually more brutal, right, and more macabre with the death. But this is showing basically what it was able to do. And I mean, again, reading about it, I've been there, seeing the ground, understanding what's happening. They're bottlenecked. It was just like a free-for-all shoot, basically. And I've heard other stories, not from this wing, but a flying, Typhoon, and the stories and how, and maybe it's a bit much, but the smell of it was something that I've heard from people, but also read about it, because they're flying that low because they could.
And also too, most folks like yourself who've studied those battles know that the German army was largely horse driven. It was just the Panzer and the Panzer Grenadier units that were fully mechanized. And even at that stage of the war, the Germans were relying on horses to move their stuff. And that's why the smell of the Falaise Gap was so horrendous is because of the number of dead horses and animals.
Yeah, it's a striking part of this, and here's another one showing it, and just the constant destruction, right, that was caused, and everything. It's a important part of this. So I'm just wondering if maybe we can. One question I had, if that's okay, just to kind of end this a little bit, is this particular wing, the squadrons. Where were they positioned at this point for the Falaise Gap? How close were they to, Chambois and Turn and where all this is happening?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how close they were, but I'm gonna guess, but they were probably close to the D-Day beachhead. You know what I mean? I don't think the airfields they were flying from were the first sort of permanent airfields that were built in Normandy shortly after D-Day, and that's probably where they were flying from, because as the Falaise battle began, there was the Cobra outbreak with the Americans, and then there was the British and the Canadians that broke out. So they wouldn't have had time to move the airfields closer to the front. So they would have been positioned, I think, in the sort of 20 miles from the Normandy beachhead sort of thing.
Yeah,
bases there.
Well, which is still very close to these places.
It's still very close. They had more than enough range to get over Falaise. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Because I think that's just an interesting. Because again, this is just the way the pictures that you sent me and everything. Because obviously, what you were talking about earlier, the advances happen so fast. They're well without range. Sorry, out of range. But then they catch up, and this goes on for the rest of the war as well. This isn't just Normandy. There's support other places. Now, I guess maybe this might be a good place to end. And again, this is probably just more of your opinion, but it's part of your book. Is where do you think they were at their most effective? Was it in the air, or was that throughout the whole, sort of Northwest Europe? Was it towards the end? Was it Normandy? Like, just overall, not even necessarily air to air, but just generally speaking.
I would say, their most effective and biggest contribution, I would say, was in the air to air role. The fact that they shot down, over 300 German airplanes from D-Day to VE Day, considering that the German Air Force, was in rapid decline at that point. The fact that they shot down a number of German jets during the campaign. Somebody asked me, well, why was 126 Wing so successful? And I think it was a combination of being in the right place at the right time with targets of opportunity, pilot training, tactics, leadership. They had great ground control. They had radar control over the battlefield. German pilots at that stage of the war weren't the best. So the victories maybe came a little bit easier. One pilot, I think his name is Peter Audet, he scored, came ace in a day. He shot down 5 ME-109 and a couple of Focke-Wulfs in under 10 minutes, which tells you either the Germans didn't know what they were doing, or he was quite fortunate to sneak up on them and shoot them down without seeing. But that kind of thing was not a common occurrence, but helped the pilots up their scores. Of course, during the January 1st Luftwaffe raid, Baden Plate raid, on January 1st, 1945, 126 Wing, they shot down 28 fighters that day, which was one of the highest counts for one of the fighter wings involved during that battle. So they had some outstanding days like that. I would just say that their effectiveness, first and foremost, was in the air-to-air arena. The second was an interdiction of German communications, attacking trains. They did a lot of rail busting, doing up rail lines.
Which is not talked about. Sorry, not to cut you off, but to me that's so interesting because I found some footage that's on the channel of they're Mustangs, they're not Spitfires, but the train busting. I've done some research on individuals who are known as train busters, and how little that's discussed. I mean, to me, it's seemingly I have a few theories why, because it's just it's not that sexy history as people like to say. It's not dashing air combat. It's not that Normandy thing, but it's so important, especially as the war moves on. The Germans are running out of every resource. So if you can hammer a bunch of engines and rail lines, that's going to do major damage. So I think that it's an interesting thing that just is not discussed.
Yeah, I mean, as we discussed before, accuracy wasn't so great, and it took a lot of bombs to hit a small rail line. That's in and itself is a really small target.
Yes.
But anytime you can, cause your enemy to expend more energy on repair, delay. Sometimes you actually, hit a train full of ammunition or fuel, things of that nature. Then the repercussions to the frontline troops get compounded, and so it may not seem that way for the frontline infantrymen going up against the Germans, but when the Germans
shooting at us,
have ammunition or something, then you're helping the cause.
Yeah. Also, sorry, I cut you off. You're saying that the best was air, and then interdiction against
interdiction, and air and interdiction. That was their, direct support for the army on troops on the ground was probably the third, because they didn't, again, a third of their sorties were in that area. And again, if you tie in their accuracy with the bombs, and they were more accurate strafing, but again, that's strafing is pinpoint targets, and unless you catch troops out in the open, or you've got soft skin vehicles, then your armament and strafing is not going to be that effective.
Yeah, 303 or 50 cal is not going to do much against a Tiger tank or a Panzer IV or whatever. So it's an interesting point. But again, I think that, and maybe this can be my last question, is with because you talk about in your book, talk about now with the development of the tactical air force, when they were developed, was it just you are going to take on this overall role of supporting the army on the ground, or was it like you're gonna have to hit targets of opportunity, or did they just give them kind of a blank objective of support the army? Well, I guess basically what I'm saying is trying to, because people argue, they didn't do what they were told, basically.
No, I think that's again a misconception. That yes, they had tactical air force and they would bomb targets the army wanted them to bomb, and they would blow a hole open in the front, and the tanks and the infantry would pour through, and they would destroy all the tanks and that sort of thing. And those occasions were quite rare, if they ever did happen. So the Allies, the air commanders realized that the potential and the ability of their aircraft and what they could do was better assigned to interdict transportation targets, fuel dumps, ammo dumps, marshalling guards, barges, convoys on the move, restrict, delay, attack those resources that are supplying the frontline German army. That was the best use of their aircraft. And it's because, again, just the accuracy of the weapons involved is. Now, if they had incorporated the A-36, or like the French army in France had Dauntless dive bombers, their accuracy might have gone way up, and they might have been assigned more pinpoint targets than they were assigned, because again, the Spitfire was not a dive bomber.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's, I don't know, maybe that's for another time, but and you talked about this on other channels, like I saw you on World War II TV talking about the Dauntless, and it's just so interesting. And again, we're getting to the end of this one, but and it's not really here, but the Navy has different expectations, and then the Air Force, and then again, but this is a Commonwealth, so this is different again. You've got so many different moving parts. It's just an interesting, but I think that's maybe for another time. But again, the idea of dive bombing and expectation and limitation and then everything, it's you must keep this in mind, right? For everything when discussing this. And again, because that just comes up because I do quite a bit of work with Normandy, right, about this whole lack of air power helping in that direct role. And I'm like, okay, well, is that what they were meant to do? And it seems the answer is not necessarily, right? So it's not so simple, right? But so I think that was good. That was a really good understanding of this one particular wing of the RCAF, but just generally of what these things mean and limitations of the Spitfire. Again, not just to disparage an aircraft just because, we're not here doing that. But it
did the best it could with the job it was given. And again, we always come back to, it's just never designed to do that. Yeah,
it's you can't expect it to do something it's not meant to do, right? I mean, maybe that's the expectation that people have, right? It's like, well, these other aircraft were designed for this, but they did it. So, I think it's a bit of a setting up for a failure of expectations. Anyway, so I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody watching, and then I'll come back and then we'll sign up.
All right.
So thanks everyone for watching. Great show, very informative, very different niche technical details here, which I think is great to have on the channel and something going into that level. And Donald's a great guest. So thanks again for everyone for watching. If you haven't yet subscribed, please do. It really helps me out. Same with commenting below and liking the video while watching it is extremely helpful. So please do that. If you want to help support the channel and keep seeing things like this, please go to Patreon and give me some support if you can to help me keep running the channel. And like I said earlier, Donald's book is amazing and really, really good to check out in the detail. I was so impressed with. So do check it out. Check it out and get it if you can. That also helps me out with a little bit from buying it through those links. Also, just a quick wrap up. Paul Woodhatch from World War II TV will be on the channel on Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. So check that out. It's going to be we're going to be talking about his experience in Canadian battlefields, but I'm sure we'll talk about all kinds of stuff because that's what happens when we get talking. So it'll be a good one, a really interesting one. So everyone, thanks again for watching and check us out on Patreon if you can. So thanks, Donald. Thanks again. I really appreciate coming on talking about this.
Oh, I don't know if you've seen this book.
Yeah, I have it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's on my shelf behind me. Yeah, it's a good one. It's Robert Egan's book. Maybe showing us there. Canadians Under Fire. It's an interesting one talking about motivation, combat, all that stuff. It's a really interesting read. Lots going on there. It's another one I do tell people to check out all the time. Yeah. So again, everyone, thanks for watching. Thanks for coming on, Donald. I really appreciate it. And I'll see everybody on Friday.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.